This is a great occasion, one of the several occasions for the Center for Christianity and Business during the year, and to have Archie Dunham here with us today is really a high water mark for us. So I'm going to give an introduction to Mr. Dunham here in a bit, but I just want to start by saying how glad we are to have you, and all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming to the HBU campus. We have a lot going on at the university, and I wish I could take 10 minutes and extol all those virtues, but a lot is going on. But I will mention one or two things. We have just recently, about a year ago, our board approved the start of a College of Engineering, and we're very excited about that. And Stan Napper is here, our dean, founding dean. He's just raising his hand there, but stand up there for just a second, Stan. And we have several members of the Engineering Advisory Board who are here. If you're on that Engineering Advisory Board, would you lift your hand and let us see you? Look at that. So this is just one of the greatest advisory boards I've ever been around, and we're so grateful for their leadership and for the tremendous support they have been. We've expanded the online offerings at HBU, so that's another exciting development. But a lot's going on. If you have the opportunity, please avail yourselves of the various ways that we try to communicate. And of course, it would be terrible if I didn't mention the capital campaign we're in. How could I not mention that? So anyway, make sure you avail yourself of that opportunity as well. Well, it's my privilege to introduce a great friend, not only to HBU and a friend to so many of you, but also a personal friend. Sue and I counted really a surprising blessing in life that we get to call Archie and Linda our friends. We've been with them many times on social occasions, and you feel like you're hobnobbing, with kind of the people who are just the elites of the business world, but more than that, tremendous Christian people who love the Lord and have given themselves to serving the Lord. Archie grew up in Oklahoma. His parents, just wonderful Christian people. His father died of cancer much too early, and Archie saw his mother provide for their family and work tremendously hard. His mother, again, took up that mantle of providing for this family. Archie has a brother, and it's really amazing to look at his roots and see the kinds of influences in his life. But a mother who worked hard. Archie realized, of course, he had to contribute as well. And so I think by the time he was 8 years old, he was selling seeds and pears door to door. He began mowing yards and throwing a newspaper. He worked highway construction in order to ensure that he could go to his beloved OU, and he did. He went to OU, got into the Marine reserves there, the Marine program. And so in, I think, 1960, when you graduated from OU with a degree in geological engineering, well, he married Linda a couple of days after that, so they've been married for 57, this year will be 58 years. But he had that commission as a second lieutenant. He had that degree from OU, and then 4 years of service, went to Quantico, and 4 years of service in the Marine Corps. In that time, he became interested also in economics, went back to OU, enrolled in an MBA program, finished at the top of his class, was recruited by 17, I think, different energy companies, and just has had this fabulous career in business that has stretched really all across the world. Archie, for example, in I think it was about 1996, he became the president and CEO of Conoco, and then led out in what at that time was the largest IPO separation, the separation of DuPont from Conoco, the largest IPO separation in the history of American business. And then a couple of years later, 1998 it was, he led in the merger of equals, Conoco Phillips, 1998, which made ConocoPhillips the third largest energy company in America and the fifth largest energy company in the world at that time. So just an amazing career. But the impressive thing to me is all of those things go back to a family where the Bible was honored, Christ was honored, getting up and going to church was habitual and routine, and developed the fabric of a life committed to work and discipline and faith and laying your life before the Lord. Archie and Linda have tremendous family. They have 3 children, Steve and Laura and Carrie, and they've got, I want to say at least 8 grandchildren. And I think just recently added their 4th great-grandchild. So they have a wonderful time at family gatherings. And the children are very impressive professionals and Christian people in their own right. So just so much going on. Archie, as you can imagine, and I'll try to shorten my time here. He is somebody that really you know well, but he's been involved in so many professional organizations. I mean, the list is huge. The American Petroleum Institute, for example, and Russia, U.S. Business Council, and so on. Many professional organizations. He has been involved in service, in volunteer directorships and trusteeships that, again, is just a lengthy list, not the least of which, for example, is Memorial Hermann right here, or the Houston Symphony, or the Houston Grand Opera, and so on. So extremely involved. The George H.W. Bush Presidential Library Foundation. So those kinds of involvements have characterized Archie's life. Many, many awards, international citizen of the world. I mean, it's really remarkable. And in the midst of all of the honors, an honorary doctorate from OU, an honorary doctorate from HBU, in the midst of all of the honors that he has received, I think he has said that being named Father of the Year in the 2000s was the greatest honor he had ever received. And that's understandable. I think all of us appreciate that and acknowledge that. So just a wonderfully devoted follower of our Lord, man of international business expertise and experience, and just been a tremendous friend to HBU. He and Linda are wonderful philanthropists. They have given all over, not just Houston, but all over the world. To the University of Oklahoma, their name is in various places, leadership centers, and so on. Here at HBU, we were seated in McNair Hall between the Dunham Bible Museum and the Dunham Theater in the Morris Cultural Arts Center. And then just to my left is Dunham Field, and then the Dunham College of Business is here on the campus. So we have been blessed by their tremendous generosity, which shows the deep commitment that Archie and Linda have to Christian values and the Christian faith in all that they do. So Archie, come on up here and join me. And our format today is going to be a little Q&A. I have a few prepared questions, but you're going to get to ask some questions later. So be prepared. But welcome Archie Dunham with me, would you? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Archie, I want to just kind of pick up from your background there a little bit and ask you to, however you want to put it, either pay homage to your mom and dad, or your upbringing in Oklahoma, the kinds of things that really shaped you and made you who you are.
Well, first of all, thank you for a very kind introduction. You always flatter me too much, but I appreciate it anyway. I had the real pleasure, I think and a blessing, of growing up in small town America, a little town called Ada, Oklahoma, about 100 miles north of Dallas. Small town, 17,000 people. And I think that, it really is a blessing to be able, at least when I was young, to be able to be given a lot of latitude, a lot of freedom. You didn't have to worry about gangs, you didn't have to worry about drugs. families took care of families. And if I certainly wasn't a perfect child, none of us are, but if I, happened to be speeding down 16th Street on the way to visit Linda at her home on West 17th, I could probably know that at the end of the day, some other person that lived on 16th Street was going to call my dad and tell me that I'd been speeding down the street. And so my point is that, families took care of families, and the values, I think, in that part of the world were really a major influence on my life. My dad did die when I was young. I was, I think, 22 years old. My mom, when I started at the University of Oklahoma, because we didn't have any money, and so she went back to work as a nurse. My dad was working, I was working, my brother was working. And so when my dad died, my mother, who at the time was, I think, around 53 years old, she decided she'd like to go back to nursing school to get a nursing degree. And the closest one was in Texas, at Sherman, Texas, but you had to be under age 50 at that time in order to enroll in nursing school, which is probably a good rule of thumb. But anyway, she asked for an exemption so that she could go back and get her degree, and so she did. She graduated at the top of her class. She continued to work active well into her late 70s. And she was such a good nurse that people, when their relatives were in distress or when they were dying or when they needed help, they would always call, even after my mother retired in her 80s, and after she would come back and sit with their loved ones at the hospital. And so Mom and Dad both had a tremendous influence on my life. As you said, we went to church regularly. That means Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and that was good. That was a big influence, I think, on my life, and so a tremendous blessing to have parents like that.
Archie, I remember hearing you tell a story of several key moments in your life where you had the Lord's guidance to make different kinds of decisions, and how important the scriptures were, for example, in that. But pick a time or two that you could tell us about of maybe a tough business decision, whether it was maybe an ethical decision, or just maybe a decision to accept a job, how you went through that process.
You ask tough questions, but I'll share that. I think the first thing that I would like to share, and I share this specifically with any of the students that are here today, because I think it was really an inflection point in my life, a turning point in my life. As I said, I grew up in the church. I became a Christian at a very young age. Tried to do everything that I thought God was trying to impress on me to do. But the one thing that I had not done is that I had not turned control of my life over to Christ. And I was a pretty strong-willed young man. I thought that I knew what was best for my life and for my family. And so I really struggled against making my own decisions 100% based on my own wisdom, my own experience and background, or trying to get God's direction and God's guidance in those decisions. And we had an experience in 1970. Linda and I were members of Spring Baptist Church in North Houston. The pastor, the church was landlocked, like a lot of churches that, especially in the suburbs, I think. And the pastor said, "Archie, would you kind of form a little committee and go out and see if you can buy this 17 acres of land that surrounds the church so that we can have land to expand our educational space and have more land for parking?" And I said, "Sure, I'll be glad to do that." So I picked a vice president with another energy company. I picked a couple of prominent attorneys that were members of our church, a banker, and an elderly deacon. Elderly deacon his name was Luther Boney. I'll always remember his name. So we started having meetings with the owners of the land. The land was owned by 7 doctors. Now, the only thing worse than trying to negotiate with 7 doctors would be trying to negotiate with 7 attorneys. But anyway, we started having our meetings, and we were making no progress whatsoever. And after every meeting, we'd go back to the bank boardroom, and we would kind of critique what we did right and why we weren't successful. And the old deacon would say, "Archie," he said, "are you trying to do this, just with our own understanding and wisdom? Are you trying to ask for God's help in this?" And of course, I would always say, "Well, of course we're asking for God's help." But of course we weren't. And so after about 4 or 5 of these meetings, I finally, I'm kind of hard-headed, so it takes a while, but I finally realized that we really weren't seeking God's guidance and God's direction and trying to solve this problem. And so we turned that problem over to God, and He solved the problem for us. And within a few months, we were able to consummate the transaction. And today, the church is a huge church in North Houston because they had the land to grow. So that experience had a big impact on me. And so as I kind of struggled with that issue over a several-month period of time, I still remember sitting on a swing in the backyard in our home in Spring, Texas, in Northampton. And I finally said, "Okay, God." Sorry, but I said, "If you want me to stay in hot, humid, mosquito-infested Houston for the next 10 years, and if you want me to stay in this job that I'm in right now for the next 10 years, then I'm going to be happy, and I'm going to do it." And so basically, that was the most important, I think, decision that I made. I turned control of my life totally over to God. I turned control of my family over to God. And from then on, it was a tremendous blessing in our life. And I'll share one other instance. It was interesting, after about a year from me having that one-on-one relationship, conversation with God, I had the opportunity to move to California with Conoco. And it was a tremendous promotion, a tremendous opportunity. I was asked to be the CEO of like a $2 billion small subsidiary in California, like a baby oil company. We had a couple of refineries and retail and everything. It was a wonderful job. And Linda and I were involved in the local church there. We were teaching young adults, and we were studying, I believe, the book of Galatians. And I'd been there probably about 18 months. I was executive vice president initially, so not president, but executive vice president. So I'd been there about 18 months, and my secretary comes in the office one day, and she says, "The president of Conoco's on the phone." I said, "The president of Conoco? I'm not used to talking to the president of Conoco." And "Yeah, he wants to, on the phone, he wants to talk to you." So I pick up the phone, and he said, "Archie," he says, "we've really got a great opportunity for you." He said, "We bought 150 acres out on Interstate 10 in Houston. We want to build a new college campus corporate headquarters. It'll be the first one in America, even before GE. And we want you to come and be the project manager and lead this project. It's a great opportunity, a big promotion." He said, "You talk to Linda and y'all think about it, and then give me a call back in a week." So we'd been studying Galatians, and so I started praying about, is this something I should do or something that I should not do? And so after a couple of weeks, or after a week, I found a verse in Galatians where Paul was talking. Basically, he was saying, you're really doing well. Everything is doing fine. You're running the race correctly. Why you want to do something else? And that was God telling me that I should stay in California. And I mean, it wasn't like I was opening up a Bible and putting my finger down and looking at a verse or something. I'd been praying about this, and I'd been studying God's Word, and I'd been seeking His direction. And so to me, in my heart, that said I should not leave California. And so I called the president of the company, and I very respectfully tell him that I think maybe my job is not finished in California, that I need to stay. And he was very kind and said, oh, I understand. He said, that's okay. He said, you'll have other opportunities, so good luck to you and Linda. Probably 15 minutes after I made that phone call, my phone rings. And it's the executive vice president in Houston. And about 15 minutes later, it's the vice president in Houston. And they're saying, have you lost your mind? He said, you don't tell the president, that you're not going to take on the responsibility. You have to do this. And so we've talked to the president, and we've told him that you're going to rethink this, and you'll call him back in a week. It's the honest to God truth. So I said, okay, I'll think about it. And the more I studied the book of Galatians, the more I was convinced, that God wanted me to stay in California. And so, I called him back, and I declined the opportunity. He was very kind, said, you'll have other opportunities, so don't worry about it. And I think 8 weeks later, I was promoted to the presidency of the subsidiary company, wow, which was probably the second best job that I ever had. And so, God honored that. And so, and there's kind of an interesting sub-paragraph there. While Linda and I were in California and we were teaching young adults, as I said, we had many opportunities to counsel these young adults. And we were in San Clemente, California, Camp Pendleton, it's just south, a large Marine base. And so we had a lot of young lieutenants, a lot of young officers in our Bible class. And at one time there was a young couple that wanted to come to the house and wanted to talk and counsel and get our advice. And so we did that, very routinely. 25 years later, Linda and I were invited to the Commandant's quarters at 8th and I Street in Washington, D.C. to attend a parade, a Marine Corps parade honoring a head of state that was there for a presidential visit. And so we attended, we were staying with the Commandant, 4-star general. We went to the parade that evening. It was a beautiful summer evening with all the Marine band and the drill teams, and they were throwing their rifles back and forth in close order drill. And we were sitting there in the grandstands, as an honored guest. And at the end of the event, this young colonel or major walks up to me, and he said, Mr. Dunham, he said, my commanding officer would like to talk to you. Would you like to go visit with him? And I said, sure, I'd be glad to. I mean, when you're CEO of a large company, a lot of people want to talk to you. And so, you try to be kind and you try to accommodate them. And so I didn't know who this person was, but I thought, well, I have a responsibility to go and talk to this commanding officer. So I went back behind the grandstands, back to where the Marine quarters were. And this young bird colonel walked out of his office, and he said, you don't remember me, do you? And I said, no. And so he took out a Bible that he had in his breast pocket. This is a Marine bird colonel. And he said, I came to your house 25 years ago, and you and your wife counseled me and told us that you thought that we should probably stay in the Marine Corps. And he said, and so I did that. I prayed, I sought God's direction, I followed his will for my life. And he said, today, I just want you to know that I'm the commander of the Marine detachment in Washington, D.C. that is responsible for protecting the President of the United States. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that 25 years previous, but God knew it. God, that's why I was told to stay in California.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Hearing you mention that young couple and others came to seek your advice and Linda's, I'm not surprised to hear that. One of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for our conversation, I remember thinking to myself, I've known so many times when you're around Archie in a small group, people want his opinion. And I've heard people say, I want to be sure and ask Mr. Dunham what he thinks about this. He is sought out. It might be an energy question. It might be, of course, a business leadership question, or a political question about the way things are going. And if you had the opportunity, and we've got some grad students and students here, if you had the opportunity to mention to young people in college or maybe early in their career, just any kind of words of advice, either, what would it be about either habits or how to grow and develop, or the kinds of things they could do to be, whether a leader or just to honor the Lord in their lives? Any just practical guidance?
Well, I give guidance to my grandkids all the time, and whether they want it or not. But I talk to my grandkids a lot about the importance of integrity. And, there are a lot of things now on social media about servant leaders, about followers, and what the attributes are, of both of those. And I think in nearly every case, integrity, honesty, you've got to be a person of integrity. And in life, if you're not a person of integrity in your home and in the office, it's just a matter of time, until you're going to have really an unhappy situation. And you look at what's happening right now, and especially in the Hollywood and Congress, and I mean, it's sad, and it's all a consequence of a lack of integrity. And so integrity, I think, in your home and in your office is very important. Perseverance, I think people have to, they have to just persevere, whether it's in the job or whether it's in prayer. I was just telling Sue a while ago that my granddaughter and I, we've been praying for her to get admitted to a physician assistant school for 2.5 years. She, her prayer was answered Wednesday morning. She called me. Every day we're praying for her. God, open the door, make it so obvious to her as to where you want to go to school. And so, that's perseverance. Just keep praying, keep working hard, keep pursuing your dream, keep going to school. Perseverance, like my mom, when she was 50-something years old, she was going to go back to college. She was going to get her nursing degree. Perseverance, and then wisdom, of course. And I tell my grandkids, my two favorite books in the world, I guess, is in Proverbs in the Old Testament, and the book of James in the New Testament. And I tell my kids, I try to read a chapter in Proverbs every morning. And I think every CEO, every business person ought to read a chapter in Proverbs and a chapter in the book of James every day if you want to be a good leader. One thing I learned, you asked for different, so I'll get out of Christianity here for a minute, but in the Marine Corps, the 5 Ps, I tell my grandkids, 5 Ps, prior planning prevents poor performance. You got to know where you're going. And you got to be prepared. For every interaction, you've got to be prepared. So prior planning prevents poor performance. And then probably my favorite verse in the Bible, and what's my second favorite, is quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. James, I think 1:19 or 20. And I used to put the first letters of those words, quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, in every board meeting that I had, every management meeting I had. Because one of my shortcomings is I hear real quick, and I sometimes speak too quick, and then sometimes I get angry. And so that message was for me, quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. And I think that's good advice in your home, especially with your children. Listen carefully and don't react too quickly. And it's probably true with grandkids as well, and also young couples. So those are kind of some things I don't ever forget.
I've got one more, and then I'm going to let the audience speak up here. But you're well into your 70s. But I don't know anybody that works any harder than you, whether it's on a ranch or at your real estate development business. After Archie retired from ConocoPhillips, he founded a real estate development company, Dunham Enterprises.
Enterprises.
Yeah. and they've developed, it's an 1,100 plus home, Stone Creek Ranch.
You're pretty good.
Yeah, Stone Creek Ranch. So it's kind of amazing. So that obviously, you've continued to work. That's talk about, people. We've all seen people who once they retire, their health perhaps breaks, but talk about the importance of staying busy, of being productive, and so on.
Well, that's a really good question, and I think you have to take a lot of factors into consideration. I mean, first of all, you have to look at your own health when you retire. You have to look at the health of your spouse when you retire. I think you need to have a plan. I had lunch with a gentleman earlier this week who's retired, a Conacoan, one of our senior officers, and he said, when I retired, my objective was to fish every premier trout fishing stream in North America. And he's doing it, And so his wife, and he has daughters, he has no sons, and so when he goes fishing, well, then his wife goes to some spa or resort, and they enjoy, what they enjoy doing. And I thought, well, that's wise, that's good. I mean, they both knew, husband and wife, what they were going to do, when he retired from his business career. I didn't plan on getting into the real estate business when I retired. My daughter and son-in-law were missionaries in Mexico City for 10 years. And they, after about 10 years, they came back and said, Daddy, we're frustrated with the Southern Baptist International ministry. It's just too bureaucratic, and I'm a Baptist, so I can criticize myself. And I understand bureaucracy. I remember Dr. Young at Second Baptist being critical of the bureaucracy as well in the convention. So they said, we try all these new things, and they're very successful, and we bring people to Christ, and then the bureaucracy says, well, that's not the way we've done it for the last 150 years. So, you need to quit doing it. So finally they got frustrated, and they came back to Houston. And so they said, we're going to form our own church, our own interdenominational church. And I said, okay, that's great. And so my daughter and son-in-law and 3 kids, there are 5 of them, and they started meeting in schools, which you can do in Texas. You kind of go from one school as the crowd gets bigger, you go to another school, and you keep bouncing around until you kind of run out of schools. And so after about 3 years, well, then Laura and Mark come to my home office, and they sit down, and they're nearly crying, and they say, Daddy, nobody will sell us any land. And as Stuart knows here, and a lot of developers don't sell land to churches because churches don't pay taxes, and so the developer can't get reimbursed for the underground utilities, and so nobody would sell Mark and Laura any land. And so Daddy and Mama, so we went out and we bought 525 acres at the corner of Becker Road and 290. And so we gave Mark and Laura about 60 acres, which is the amount of land it takes to build a mega church. And the church is now about 10 years old. They had 20,000 people there last Easter. They had 15,000 at Christmas, and they probably run 10 or 12,000 every weekend. And so that's how I got into the land business. And Kerry said, what are you going to do with the rest of this land? For another, we had 465 acres left. And I said, well, I don't have any idea. He said, well, why don't we just develop it? And so I'm not real smart. So I said, okay. And and it's really been fun because I knew absolutely nothing about that business, and it's a whole new world, with mud districts and how reimbursements work, and putting in all the utilities, and dealing with builders, and dealing with homeowner associations, and dealing with the bureaucracy of Houston and the county of Harris County, getting permits and all those kinds of issues. And so it's been kind of fun. Maybe one project been okay, but then I made the second mistake, and I bought a much bigger piece of land right inside the the Grand Parkway, and now we're rapidly starting to develop that. So I now say, well, I guess, I'll not see the end of that one, but maybe my 3 kids will.
Yeah.
So that'll give Kerry something to do the rest of his life.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, let me. I've enjoyed posing some questions, but I want to hear from. Yes, Chris.
So, you've been a leader for a long time. You've been a leader at home, Father of the Year. It's January. I've already fallen out of that race. Yeah, sure. So, as a leader, whether it's been at home or in the Marines or in your office, outside of your title as father or CEO or executive vice president, what's the main reason people follow you?
Man, they're getting worse.
I know that was hard. You want me to go back to my list of questions?
Well, I hope I shared a few attributes. The attributes I shared a few minutes ago on integrity and perseverance and wisdom, those are the 3 main pillars of the Dunham crest at the Dunham Residential College at the University of Oklahoma. And so we've tried to, I've tried to impress those 3 values on my children and my grandchildren, and I hope to some small degree they reflect my values. And I think that's hopefully why people will at least listen a little bit to what I have to say.
Yes, Mr. Morris, Dr. Stuart Morris here.
Archie is a world traveler. I just assume you might have heard of Russia. I just wondered if you ever been there. And what about this idiot in President of the United States and Russia? What all, could you give us about a 45-minute?
I know Russia well. Conoco at one time was the largest investor in Russia. This would have been in 1988 to probably 2004, plus or minus. And I was chair of the U.S.-Russia Business Council, which was the kind of the primary U.S. business entity that interacted with its counterpart in Russia. At that time, Russia, when I first went to Russia in 1988, it was like the United States in 1930. It was in total depression. And if you walked in a grocery store, there was no bread, there was no milk, there would be 3 cans of beans maybe, 5 bottles of vodka. But things were really in bad shape. And because the energy industry went to Russia and helped them open up their resources, then within a very brief period of time, I would say within 10 years, Russia had shopping centers that were nicer than any in the United States. They rivaled those in Paris and in London. In 1988, the women just were totally unattractive because they didn't know any better. I mean, there was no television, there was no internet, there was no way for them to know what women looked like in the rest of the world. I'm talking about makeup and doing your hair and to make yourself, look attractive. They didn't even know that. And so they were in just total depression. But in 10 years, there were more Mercedes and Lexus on the roads of Moscow than in Houston, New York City, or Paris. So they moved very rapidly. Now, they were a struggling democracy beginning in the early 90s. And just like the United States in the early 18th century, we were struggling. Democracy is not an easy form of government. In the area that we were operating in, we had a snowmobile mechanic elected to the governorship, and that's someone I had to work with. And when we wanted a permit to drill a well, he wanted a bribe. And so I had to share with him that we don't give $5 bribes. And I said, if I can't get the permit based on our performance, then I'm going to go to Moscow, and I'm going to meet, depending on who it was, Yeltsin or Gorbachev. And do you want the largest U.S. company leaving Russia because of corruption and have that on the front page of the New York Times? And of course, no, they didn't want that. And so we were able, to continue to grow. And I get people criticize Putin a lot. I think Putin recognized that in a sophomoric democratic form of government with corruption, probably just like John Kennedy in the United States. I mean, the father of our president, he was a bootlegger, until he realized it was probably better to be honest than to be corrupt. And so you learn, I think, politicians learn over time it's better to be honest and to have integrity. And so I think Putin realized that he needed to pull power back into the central government so that Western companies, whether they were English or French or German or U.S., that we were not going to invest unless they had a clean climate, a clean investment climate, a climate of integrity. And then I think once he pulled the power back into the center, unfortunately then he started enjoying the centralized power, and that's the issue we have today. But I think Gorbachev will go down in history as probably the George Washington of Russia. He allowed democracy to come. He allowed capitalism to come. It's been corroded and corrupted, I think, over the last 10 years. But long term, I think that they will obviously be a very strong, powerful country, just as China is. And China, Russia, India, the U.S. will be the four largest capitalistic, quasi-capitalistic forms of government, and I think the strongest countries in the world. I don't have no idea about Trump and Russia, but personally, I don't believe it at all. But the questions are getting harder.
I know it. And I can't. This next one. Let's get you promise this is an easy question? I think that's John, isn't it?
Yeah, thank you so much for your sharing with us, especially on surrendering control to Jesus Christ. I know we all struggle with that in the flesh, and it's so much better when we do. So let me ask you maybe a hard question. As the highest ranking officer of a huge publicly traded company, how do you walk the walk of being a follower of Jesus Christ in that workplace that has a lot of political correctness and secular sensitivities and that sort of thing? And perhaps that would help some of us as we move into those roles.
That's a great question, and really, really an important question. Leaders have the responsibility to create the vision and the strategies for their companies, and then to execute the vision and the strategy. And one of the most important parts of that responsibility is creating the culture and the values for the company. And I think the companies that have gotten into trouble, whether they're Hollywood kind of companies or media, television personalities, that occurred, in my opinion, because there was no value, there was no culture of integrity, no culture of how people are supposed to interact with each other. Linda and I sat around and we watched the evening news and we said, well, this person committed a sexual harassment crime. I mean, I can't believe that. In Conoco, we had a I don't know whether you want to call it a value or a culture, but it was a dadgum strict rule. You did not have a relationship, you did not date a subordinate in our company. If I found out, you would be fired. Now you would have a choice. Either you could quit or the other person could quit, but you both could not remain in the company, because that just makes common sense. You can't make objective decisions if you're having a relationship with another person in the company. And so that is the responsibility of the CEO. And some of you may remember that I agreed to be chairman of Chesapeake in, I think, 2012. A great company. It'll go down in history as a pioneer in natural gas fracking, and the CEO at the time, Aubrey McClendon, a great entrepreneur, brilliant person. I used to make speeches and say that Aubrey probably leased more acreage in one of the shale plays around the United States before the CEO of ConocoPhillips or the CEO of Exxon had their morning coffee. They didn't know what had happened, because he reached out and ran. He was quick, he was nimble. He did all kinds of good things, but he didn't have the culture. He didn't have a culture of integrity, and that's why the company got in trouble. And that's why I had to terminate the CEO, and I terminated all the senior management of the company except for one person. And we recreated the company then with a value of absolute, utmost integrity. And that's the responsibility of the CEO. And I think just as important as setting the strategy and executing the strategy is establishing the culture and not bending with the wind. When I was CEO of Conoco, that was, back in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and a lot of companies were, and if I offend you by this, I'm sorry, but a lot of companies were granting benefits to non-spouses. And to me, that's wrong. I mean, the benefits are supposed to be for the wife or the husband of the employee, not a partner of the employee. And my board knew that, that's where I was. And so we didn't have to worry about getting involved in that discussion because I was not going to bend with a secular wind of what's happening in the society at large. And I think when the CEO is that kind of a leader, that the organization appreciates it. I think they lead. I think they follow those kind of leaders, and I think boards appreciate those kind of leaders. But that's their number one responsibility, in my opinion.
Yes, Joe.
Archie, talk a little bit about work and family balance when you're at that level in a company.
We had values, and one of our values in Conoco was balance, and that was the one I was least effective in. And I'm glad we still have maybe some students here because it's really an important issue. And I used to tell young employees at Conoco and ConocoPhillips and Chesapeake that there are times in your career when you have to work 60 or 80 hours a week. And I know Chris probably would agree with that from Goldman sitting here on the front row. You got to devote those hours to do the job if you expect and desire to have higher levels of responsibility later in your career. Now, there are other times in your career when you don't have to work that often. But even when you're working the 60 and 80-hour weeks, at least in my case, I went to every baseball game of my children. I went to every musical performance. I went to every piano recital. To me, that was priority number one. You've got to stay focused on your children. You've got to be there for your children, regardless of how busy you are. Now, if I'm in Russia, and all of a sudden there's something scheduled and I can't get back, well, then my kids will understand that. But short of that, you've got to be involved with your kids, with your family, with your wife, and balance is really critically important, I think. All of my direct reports knew that I fully expected them to take all of their vacation every year, and they better do it because if you don't spend time with your spouse, you don't spend time with your children, you end up having a divorce. That disrupts the family, maybe even destroys the family, but it's also disruptive in the workplace because that individual can't think, can't focus, can't be a productive employee like he or she was previously because they're worrying about what happened to them, they're worrying about why it happened, they're worrying about the impact on their children. And so I really stress the importance of spending time, with your spouse, spending time with your children. Take all of your vacation every year because balance is really important.
Good word. Got time for one more. Yes.
Dr. Sloan referenced that colleagues of all ages and associates of all types seek out your counsel and your advice. Who served in that role when you were growing up and you were starting your career, and maybe even prior to you becoming, involved in the business world like you are?
That's a great question. Like who was my mentor or who counseled me?
Yes.
I really had, Robert mentioned the fact that when I got out of graduate school, I think I had 17 companies offer me a job. The one that initially didn't offer me the job was Conoco. And so you got to kind of put it in perspective. Linda and I are back in graduate school. We have 2 children. We have no money. I'm working about half-time. She's working full-time. We couldn't afford penny bubble gum for our children. So we had finished the interview process. I had these job offers. I had pretty much in my mind decided I was going to go to work for IBM. This was 1966. That's when IBM was really taking off. It was probably the company people wanted to go to work for, kind of like Apple or Google today. I get a phone call one night, and it was this young vice president with Conoco. His name's Bob Lee. And he said, Archie, he said, I've been talking to the dean of the engineering school, and he thinks that you would really fit well into our this accelerated management development program that they had at Conoco. And I hadn't even interviewed Conoco. And he said, if I were to fly up to Norman and take you out to dinner, would you be willing to do that? And so, in my brain, I thought, I've not had a steak in 2 years. And I said, sure. I said, I'll be glad to, but I really went to get a steak. And so I went out and had dinner, and then he told me about this really aggressive development program they had. They hired maybe 10 people a year from around the United States, and it was really hard charging, 60, 80 hours a week. You got to do your job. You got to learn all about the global energy industry. I mean, we're going to give you reviews every 3 months, and I mean, it's tough. But if you survive, maybe 3 or 4 of you will make it through the program, and then you're kind of maybe on a fast track, to senior management. He said, why don't you come to Houston, you and Linda, and we'll host you for the weekend, and you can meet some of our young new employees and see if that's something that you might be interested in. And so I did that, and I got more interested, and now it's Thanksgiving, and I'm back in my hometown, and I'm having lunch with my uncle, because my dad is deceased. And he says, well, what are you going to do, And I said, well, I'm thinking about going to work for IBM. He said, why would you do that? He said, because I had told him about the opportunity with Conoco. And he said, you grew up in the oil business. Your dad was in the oil business. You've lived in oil camps. He said, why would you go to work for IBM? So, it caused me to think a little bit more, because he was my uncle, the kind of the patriarch of our family. And so I ended up going to work for Conoco, and then that vice president, that Bob Lee, that vice president, by the way, he's one of the guys that did call me in California and tell me I was crazy. But he mentored me, and I remember when I got my first, what I would call a pretty senior level middle management job, his kind of executive assistant came down to my office, and I'll always remember this because I was really a really young middle manager at that time. And he closed the door. And he said, Archie, he says, I want to share something with you. And I said, okay. And he said, you're going to be, each year you're probably going to be given, 2 or 3 really, really important responsibilities. Maybe one of them is, you're going to be in charge of a team of MBAs that go out and study the subsidiary company that we bought 20 years ago and visit all the locations and try to determine how to make it more profitable. And he said, that's really an important responsibility. And he said, then 3 months later, they may tell you that we want you to look at maybe how we can make liquid fuel for a supersonic airliner and do a real deep study here and profitability study. And then, 3 months later, they're going to say, we want you to build this complex of pipelines and pump stations and compressor stations in Louisiana to feed the ethylene plant. And he said, and then, maybe one day Bob Lee walks in your office. And he says, Archie, he said, Darlene's car has a problem, and I've got to drop it off at the Ford dealership. And would you mind taking me to the Ford dealership this afternoon after work at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or whatever he said? And he said, you may do all those other projects really well. He said, you screw up. You're late taking Mr. Lee to the body shop. He says, when it comes time for them to remember about your performance for the year and your punctuality and being on time and doing everything right, don't screw that one up. And so Bob Lee was a wise leader, another young vice president in the company, deceased today, but a great friend and a great leader in our company. It's kind of interesting. He always told me, he said, when I'm 50 years old and I have $100,000, I'm going to retire. And that's what he did.
Really?
As sad as that may be, because he was one of the highest potential people in the company. But he retired and moved to the hill country and lived happily ever after. So he was happy, and so I'm happy. Anyway, thank all of you for being here today.
That's awesome. Thank you, Archie. That's wonderful.